What if the single piece of evidence that hanged a killer was not a weapon, not a witness, but the words he spoke to his own priest? That question would force an American courtroom to rewrite its rules forever. The case of Thomas Piper begins in Boston, Massachusetts, in the years following the Civil War. By the early 1870s, Boston's South End had become a district of contradictions, and understanding those contradictions matters before any name enters the story. Along its broad new avenues stood the brick row houses of an aspiring middle class, built during a real estate boom that had promised the neighborhood a genteel, permanent future. Beneath that promise ran a rougher current. Rail yards backed onto residential blocks. Boarding houses stood within sight of church spires. Domestic servants, laborers, and clerks lived within a few streets of the institutions that employed and, in theory, sheltered them. The Warren Avenue Baptist Church stood near the center of this world, large, prosperous, and socially central, the kind of congregation whose sexton was a familiar public figure, greeting parishioners, tending the grounds, and holding keys to nearly every door in the building, including the one leading up into its bell tower. Boston in this period was also a city absorbing successive waves of Irish immigration, and its domestic labor force was disproportionately made up of young women who had crossed the Atlantic to work in households they did not own. These women moved through the city largely on foot, often alone, often after dark, in an era before consistent street lighting and before municipal policing had caught up with the pace of urban growth. It was a city, in short, that had not yet learned how vulnerable that daily arrangement could be, a fact that would be proven, more than once, before anyone connected the pattern. The building at the center of this story deserves its own brief description, since it would go on to shape the case's name in the public imagination. The Warren Avenue Baptist Church was constructed in the manner typical of the South End's new congregations: solid brick, a tall steeple, and a working bell tower reached by a narrow interior stairway, used for maintenance, for the occasional ringing of the bells, and the congregation believed harmlessly, for the pigeons that had taken up residence beneath its eaves. It was an unremarkable architectural feature in a city full of similar buildings. Nothing about it suggested, to anyone who worshipped there, that it concealed any particular danger. That belief would not survive the spring of 1875. What is not established in the sources recovered is any detailed account of the daily habits of the woman who would become the first documented victim in this case, beyond her occupation and the route she walked home. What is not documented either is any indication that she had reason to fear the man who would attack her that night, or any prior contact between them at all. She was, by every surviving account, a stranger to her killer until the moment he chose her. What is not recorded, too, is the precise household that employed her, or the family that awaited her that evening and eventually learned she would not arrive, details lost, like so much of ordinary immigrant life in this period, to a historical record that tended to preserve only the moment violence intervened. The domestic arrangement that connects victim and perpetrator in this case is, in its earliest instance, no arrangement at all, simply proximity, and the accident of a shared stretch of road after dark. Bridget Landregan was a domestic servant walking home near Dorchester on the evening of December 5, 1873. The man who would later be convicted of killing a child 18 months afterward was, that night, nothing more than a stranger somewhere on the same road, watching. Thomas W. Piper was born on April 22, 1849, in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, the second son of a farmer named T.C. Piper. He worked as a carpenter on the family farm before the household relocated to Boston in 1866. When Thomas was 17. Contemporary accounts describe him as literate, clever, and ambitious beyond his origins, a young man who moved through a series of clerking positions in the city before his devout and consistent church attendance led to his hiring as sexton of the Warren Avenue Baptist Church, a position of modest income but considerable trust. He suffered from a kidney disorder, and self-medicated it with a mixture of laudanum and alcohol, a combination known, in sufficient quantity, to produce hallucinations and altered states of mind. He was known around the neighborhood for a flowing black cape or opera cloak, worn as a matter of personal style. It was a detail that would prove consequential in the months that followed, repeated by witness after witness, long before anyone could put a name to the man wearing it. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, British Dossier, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, back to the record. The tension that destabilizes this case did not arrive through a single relationship, in the way a domestic murder often does. It arrived instead through repetition, through a pattern of violence against women that the city of Boston, for a period of nearly 2 years, failed to connect to any single source. On the night Bridget Landragin was killed, a passing couple reported hearing a struggle nearby and described, fleeing into the darkness, a cloaked, bat-like figure. Landragin's body was found with a crushed skull. Nearby lay a bloody, bat-shaped club. Investigators managed to trace that club back to a shop where Thomas Piper had worked as a carpenter, a thread of evidence that, at the time, went nowhere. It was not enough to charge him, and the case went cold. A former lover of Landragin's, a man named Thomas Cahill, was extradited from Ireland on suspicion. He too was released for lack of evidence, and was later murdered in his home country, in a killing unconnected to this one. Within hours of the Landragin attack, on that same night, a young woman named Minnie Sullivan was violently assaulted nearby and survived, unable to identify her attacker. The record suggests police said little publicly about that second assault, out of what was described at the time as courtesy toward the victim, a decision that meant 2 attacks almost certainly committed by the same hand went formally unlinked in the public record. This was the broader moment, a Reconstruction-era United States still absorbing the administrative strain of rapid urban growth, in which municipal police departments were young institutions, forensic method was rudimentary by any later standard, and a city the size of Boston could suffer a string of unsolved assaults on women without triggering the kind of coordinated city-wide response a modern department would mount. Massachusetts, in this same narrow window of years, was already contending with another and separate case of violence against children, a teenage boy named Jesse Pomeroy, convicted in 1874 of killing 2 young children and assaulting several others, a case that had already unsettled the state's confidence in its own capacity to protect the young. Boston, in other words, was a city primed by recent memory to believe that danger to children could come from an unlikely, familiar face. Newspapers of the period, increasingly commercial and increasingly hungry for sensational material, had not yet found the name that would eventually attach itself to this particular case and outlive every other detail of it. That would come later. For now, the city simply absorbed each new act of violence as an isolated tragedy, unaware it was watching a single man's escalation. In 1874, Piper met a woman named Mary Tyner on LaGrange Street, in Boston's downtown district. She worked, in the language of the period, as a girl of the town. The two shared drinks together at a saloon before returning to her home, where they eventually fell asleep. What the record establishes with confidence is this: Piper woke in the night, retrieved a hammer-like object, and struck Tyner repeatedly in the head while she slept beside him. He then left through a window rather than the door and returned to sleep inside the church, resuming his ordinary duties the following morning as though nothing had happened. Tyner survived the attack but suffered lasting and severe damage. She spent the remainder of her life, roughly a year, confined to an asylum, never able to identify the man who had struck her. A former lover of hers, a man named Colby, was arrested on suspicion and released for lack of evidence, the second wrongful arrest this case would produce before its true author was ever correctly named. On the morning of Sunday, May 23, 1875, the Warren Avenue Baptist Church held its usual services, and its usual Sunday school classes let out in the early afternoon, around 3:30. Thomas Piper, as sexton, was a familiar presence in the vestibule that morning, greeting the congregation as he always did, a face nobody in that building had any reason to distrust. A 5-year-old girl named Mabel H. Young had attended Sunday school that day. Her aunt, Augusta Hobbs, arrived at the church to collect her once classes ended. What happened next must be described with the caution the sources demand, since no witness observed the act itself directly. Piper, having consumed a substantial quantity of whiskey and laudanum that day, is understood to have approached Mabel Young with an offer to show her the pigeons kept in the church's bell tower, an offer, the later record showed, he had made to at least 3 other young girls in the recent past, all of whom had either declined or been retrieved by an adult before any harm could occur. He had, in preparation, moved a cricket bat, ordinarily used on church outings, from the sexton's room to a place near the belfry door. Mabel followed him up the stairs, unafraid of a man she had likely seen every Sunday of her short life. He followed close behind her, carrying the bat. The clinical facts of what happened next are these. Mabel Young was struck several times in the head with the bat, not once, a detailed medical testimony would later confirm and one that would matter a great deal to the case's outcome. Piper is understood, from his later account, to have intended further harm to her, but on realizing she was still alive, he abandoned that intent, moved her to another part of the belfry structure, and fled the tower. A boy standing outside the church happened to see a man leap down from the belfry level and run off across a nearby fence line, toward the railroad tracks that bordered the neighborhood, a detail that, within the hour, would place the killer within a very small radius of suspects. The concealment that followed the crime was minimal and hurried rather than elaborate. Piper made no attempt to move the body any real distance, dispose of the weapon outside the building, or construct an alibi beyond simply returning to his ordinary post downstairs. He left the child where she lay in the tower and resumed his duties as though the morning had proceeded normally. What he believed that choice would accomplish is not recorded, though it left him, for a short time, unsuspected. The discovery, as is common in cases of this kind, arrived through unrelated business rather than deliberate investigation. Members of the congregation, alerted by the boy's account of a man leaping from the tower, climbed up to look and found Mabel still alive but grievously injured, unable to speak clearly about what had happened to her. She was carried from the building and given what medical attention the period could offer, but she died the following evening, at approximately 8 o'clock, having never regained the ability to name or describe her attacker in any usable way. The investigation that followed moved with a speed that owed more to institutional memory than to forensic method. Boston's chief of police, Edward Savage, lived not far from the Warren Avenue Church, and he recalled, within hours of hearing the news, that its sexton had been a name mentioned, without sufficient evidence to act on, in connection with the still unsolved Landragon killing some 18 months earlier. That recollection, combined with the boy's description of a man leaping from the belfry and Piper's own noticeable absence from his usual station in the confusion that followed, made him the immediate, and this time, correct suspect. Officers were dispatched to locate him before the end of the day. He did not attempt to flee the neighborhood. He was found near the church itself. Piper's arrest did not come from a chase or a manhunt in any dramatic sense. It came instead from a chief of police's memory of an old, unresolved rumor, confirmed within hours by the sheer coincidence of his employment at the very building where the crime had just occurred. He was taken into custody that same day, before the wider city had any name to attach to the killing at all. In the days immediately following the arrest, investigators worked to corroborate what had, until that point, been little more than a chief's hunch. At least 3 other young girls, or their parents on their behalf, came forward once Piper's name had circulated to report that he had previously invited them, using the identical promise of pigeons in the Belfry, to accompany him up the same stairway, invitations that had, in each earlier instance, gone nowhere, either declined by a wary child or interrupted by an arriving adult. Taken individually, none of those earlier approaches had seemed worth reporting to police. Taken together, once investigators began asking, they formed a pattern that made the events of May 23 look less like a single impulsive act and more like the culmination of a method Piper had already tested and refined. While in custody, Piper was questioned by Assistant Deputy Chief of Police John Ham, who is recorded as telling him that matters would go better for him if he confessed. Ham subsequently brought the Reverend George Pentecost, Piper's own spiritual advisor, into his cell. In that conversation, Piper made statements that the prosecution would later argue were not, strictly speaking, a confession, but rather evidence of his conduct and demeanor, evidence, the government contended, of a guilty man's consciousness of what he had done. The defense objected forcefully at trial, arguing that Pentecost had been deliberately brought into Piper's cell to extract an admission under emotional and spiritual pressure, and that anything said under those conditions should be excluded entirely. This objection, and the eventual ruling on it, would become one of the case's most consequential and lasting legal legacies. An inquest was convened in the days following Mabel Young's death, as was standard procedure for any sudden or violent fatality in the period. It returned a finding consistent with what the criminal case would later confirm at length, that she had died of injuries deliberately and repeatedly inflicted, and that Thomas W. Piper was the party responsible for inflicting them. The inquest did not, and could not, resolve the deeper legal questions the case would soon raise. That task fell to the courts. Medical testimony introduced at trial was detailed and, by the standards of the era, unusually technical. Physicians who had examined Mabel Young's injuries testified specifically to the number, location, and severity of the wounds, and concluded that they could not have been produced by a single blow, establishing a pattern of repeated and deliberate force rather than one impulsive strike delivered in panic. That single medical conclusion did much of the prosecution's work for it, since it directly undercut any suggestion that the injuries might have resulted from a fall or an accident inside the tower. A separate witness, a manufacturer of an instrument called a dynamometer, designed to measure the force of blows and the impact of falling weights, testified to experiments he had conducted using a bat of similar form and weight to the one recovered from the scene, an attempt to quantify, in numerical terms, how much force such a weapon could realistically deliver. It was, by any reasonable account, an early instance of demonstrative, quasi-scientific reconstruction evidence being introduced into an American murder trial, decades before such reconstructions became a routine feature of criminal prosecution. Its ultimate weight and admissibility on appeal, the surviving record shows, was treated by the higher court with considerable caution rather than blanket approval, the justices unwilling to let a laboratory experiment substitute entirely for direct evidence of the crime itself. Piper's first trial began on December 11, 1875, and unfolded as a procedural sequence familiar to any courtroom of the period. The prosecution laid out the circumstantial chain connecting Piper to the Belfry, to the bat, and to his flight from the tower, calling witnesses to his history of approaching children with the same pigeon story, while the defense argued that no witness had directly observed the killing itself and that the entire case rested on inference rather than certainty. 3 jurors were not persuaded that inference was enough. The jury deliberated and could not reach a unanimous verdict. 9 jurors favored conviction, 3 favored acquittal. The court was forced to declare a mistrial, and the case returned, for the second time, to the beginning, an outcome that left Piper in custody, the city without resolution, and the prosecution facing the difficult task of building a stronger case from evidence that had not meaningfully changed. Piper was tried again beginning January 31, 1876, with Massachusetts Attorney General Charles R. Train personally leading the prosecution, a signal of how seriously the Commonwealth now regarded the case. The prosecution's approach in the second trial mirrored the first, but with sharper emphasis on the medical evidence of repeated blows and on Piper's conduct in custody as evidence of guilty knowledge. The defense again pressed the absence of any direct eyewitness to the killing itself, and again challenged the admissibility of Piper's statements to Reverend Pentecost. This time, the jury was unanimous. Thomas Piper was found guilty of the murder of Mabel H. Young. The stress of 2 trials, extended custody, and the accumulated weight of suspicion from the earlier, unsolved attacks appears, according to the surviving record, to have broken something in Piper's resolve. In the period following his conviction, he confessed, first offering an account that did not fully match the physical evidence, then, under further questioning, a fuller and more consistent version. He admitted to killing Mabel Young. He admitted to killing Bridget Land Reagan in 1873. He admitted to the assault on Mary Tyner. He admitted to a series of arsons committed across the same period, previously unconnected to him by investigators. And he stated that he had also killed a girl named Minnie Sullivan, a claim that sits uneasily against the earlier record of a Minnie Sullivan who survived an assault the same night as the Land Reagan killing. Whether this was the second, distinct victim sharing the same name, a confused recollection produced by years of laudanum use, or an invented addition to an already extensive confession is not established in the sources recovered. It was never independently tested at trial, since no separate prosecution followed his conviction and sentence for Mabel Young's murder. At sentencing, the court pronounced the penalty required under Massachusetts law for a conviction of murder in the first degree, death. The judge's specific remarks from the bench are not preserved in detail in the sources recovered, though the sentence itself is a matter of clear public record, entered without ambiguity following a unanimous verdict that left the court little room for leniency even had it been inclined toward any. Piper's counsel appealed the conviction to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, challenging the admission of his conversation with Reverend Pentecost, the medical testimony regarding the number of blows, and the dynamometer demonstration. The court's ruling, recorded as Commonwealth v. Piper, upheld the conviction on every point raised. It held that statements not extracted through a direct promise or threat of favor could be admitted as evidence of a defendant's conduct and guilty knowledge, even in circumstances where a formal confession might otherwise have been excluded. It held that expert medical testimony describing the mechanics of an injury was properly within the competence of physicians experienced in observing the effects of blunt trauma on the human body. And it drew a careful, cautious line around demonstrative evidence like the dynamometer experiments, weighing how far a jury could reasonably be permitted to rely on a reconstruction rather than the direct facts of the case itself. That written decision would go on to be cited for decades afterward in Massachusetts courts on questions of confession, consciousness of guilt, and the outer boundaries of expert and demonstrative testimony, a quiet, procedural inheritance from a case the public would remember only for its horror. Piper's execution was scheduled following the failure of his appeal, and it was carried out on May 26, 1876. He was hanged alongside Samuel J. Frost, a convicted murderer from Petersham, before a crowd estimated at 300 people gathered to witness the sentence carried out. His body was buried privately at Mount Hope Cemetery, without a marked headstone. Piper's family requested, following the execution, that his full written confession, given to Sheriff John M. Clark, not be released to the public in its complete form. Clark agreed to the request, reasoning that the substance of Piper's crimes was already sufficiently known to the public, and that nothing would be served by circulating further explicit detail of what he had done. In the years that followed, Boston's residents developed a peculiar civic memory of the case. For a period, Police began stopping and questioning any man seen wearing a flowing opera cloak in public, a garment closely associated with witness descriptions of the killer, until the fashion itself, by simple association, largely disappeared from the city's streets. The Warren Avenue Baptist Church continued its ministry for decades afterward, eventually merging with another congregation in 1920 and selling its building. The structure itself was demolished by the city of Boston in 1969 and replaced with a small public park, its former grounds now marked by nothing that references the events of that Sunday afternoon. The legal precedent set by Piper's appeal, by contrast, did not fade along with the building. It remained embedded in Massachusetts case law, cited by later courts confronting the same recurring question this case had first forced into the open: how much of a suspect's own conduct, absent a clean and voluntary confession, a jury may reasonably be permitted to hear as proof of guilt. Long after the sensational nickname the newspapers gave him had faded from popular memory, that narrower, procedural question kept the case alive in a different kind of record, not the front page, but the case reporter, cited by lawyers and judges who likely never learned the details of the Belfry, the pigeons, or the cricket bat at all. It is, in its own quiet way, a second kind of afterlife, one measured not in headlines but in citations, still occasionally referenced wherever an American court is asked to decide what a defendant's silence, or a defendant's words to a minister, are truly allowed to prove. The case of Thomas Piper was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1876. The case became part of the national record. It has not left,